All right. And I would just like to say thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Thank you and welcome. We're going to talk about growing a healthy garden from the ground up. This program is in a partnership with Our Water, Our World and the Alameda County-wide Clean Water Program. I am Suzanne Bontempo, Program Manager for Our Water, Our World, and joining me this afternoon is Charlotte Canner, a fellow IPM advocate and IPM educator who also helps provide services for Our Water, Our World throughout the Alameda County areas. So thank you so much for joining us today. We're really happy to be here. I'd like to start by sharing that there are no gardening mistakes, only gardening experiments. So don't be too discouraged if something doesn't go exactly the way you anticipated, because that's how we learn. And for our agenda today, we're going to be going through slides for about 45 minutes, and then we're going to leave time for your questions. So as questions come up, please don't hesitate to drop them in the chat or put them in the Q&A, because we'll get to those at the end. What we're going to learn today are the principles of integrated pest management. We're going to talk about building healthy soils, benefits of mulch, keeping the garden healthy with fertilizers, how to water, and best plants for our gardens. But I'd like to start by talking a little bit about our wonderful sponsor today, which is the Alameda County-wide Clean Water Program, which works to protect Alameda's creeks, wetlands, and bay from runoff that may carry pollutants into the waterways. Related to gardening, that means avoiding chemicals that can be washed off into the lawn and gardens and into our storm drains by irrigation systems and rain. So here in California, the San Francisco Bay is a network. It comes from a network of many watersheds throughout California. And in California, half of the water that we receive, either through snow or rainfall, ends up in the San Francisco Bay. The water, any water that isn't absorbed into the ground, is going to find its way into a local waterway or into a storm drain. Along the way, picking up any types of pollutants such as pesticides, motor oil, pet waste, debris, litter, and so forth, without getting treated before it finds its way into the San Francisco Bay. So we like to bring a little bit of attention around reducing urban runoff and reducing pesticides that might enter the waterways. And that means looking at the different types of products we use around the home and garden, and understanding that there is an alternative, that we do have a choice, and we can use products that aren't going to impose any type of harm or threat to our waterways. If you'd like to learn more about, clean water and how we can garden with a happier and healthier approach, then you can check out the website, the cleanwaterprogram.org website, and sign up to their newsletter. I'd also like to invite you to check out, they have this really cool interactive map that shows the different watersheds in Alameda County. That's really fun, so check that out. And with that, we have the Our Water, Our World program. This is a program that was designed to bring awareness between pesticides and water quality, where we provide information and education around alternatives to toxic pesticides that might impose harm to our waterways. You might recognize us for the materials in the aisle at our local retailer where you might buy pesticides, or your local garden center. We have those fact sheets which have different topics such as ants, aphids, growing healthy roses, weeds, and so forth. And these are going to be really helpful handouts for you to guide you through a less toxic approach to those pest problems. We also have little shelf talkers that we place underneath eco-friendly pesticides, so that you know when you're buying a product that is marked with one of our shelf talkers, it's going to be something that's less toxic for you and your family, as well as not posing any harm to our waterways. So with that, I'd like to share that the Our Water, Our World program is an integrated pest management educational program. And what integrated pest management is a science based decision-making process, which allows us to look at the system as a whole. In this case, it's going to be our garden. And it oftentimes when we see a problem, what we're really seeing are symptoms of the problem. And so, what integrated pest management does, it helps us dive into identifying what the problem really is and helping us understand, is this a problem that we can live with, or is it a problem that we actually have to take some action to resolve? And when we take actions, it's going to be a combination of actions, which will be cultural controls, which is increasing the health of the environment, or working with mechanical controls. These are the tools we use to manage pests. We can also work with biological controls, which is using living organisms such as beneficial insects to manage pests. And it also includes working with chemical controls, but these are the pesticides. And we'd always like to invite you to use these as last resort and always the least toxic possible. However, keep in mind, if you have a plant that's always struggled and never really performed the way you expected it, and always seems to get problems like rust or powdery mildew, or always seems to be attacked by like whitefly, give yourself permission just to get rid of that plant. That plant clearly isn't going to perform. And if we're constantly having to apply a pesticide, even when it's an eco-friendly, give yourself permission just to remove it and replace it with something that will thrive in that area and be less of a problem.
Great. And so now we know a little bit more about integrated pest management. What we're going to talk about today mostly are cultural controls, so really bolstering the health of the garden. And cultural controls are really the foundation of IPM, because if you have healthy soil, you'll have healthy plants, and healthy plants will automatically attract fewer pests. And if pests do arrive, they'll be able to fight off pest problems more easily. And before we dive into how to make healthy soil, I just wanted to cover the basics of what soil is and what we're talking about when we're talking about soil. So soil is made up of about 4 ingredients: mineral particles, water, air, and organic matter. And I have the number 5% organic matter on here. That is an estimate. 5% is really an average good soil. That number can go up to 10% organic matter, 15, even 20%. We don't really want it to go higher than that, and it's also very difficult to get higher than that. But 5% is a good goal. We're going to talk about how to increase that number as well. When we're talking about soil texture, you might have received the question, what kind of soil do you have in your yard? This is really that question. So soil texture, sand, silt, or clay, or a mixture of the 3. If you're like me, I live in San Francisco on the western half of the city. They used to be dunes, so I have sandy soil out here. That means I have big particles with lots of air, pore spaces for air and water to infiltrate. Water will infiltrate very quickly and pull the nutrients away very quickly as well. And the particles don't hold together very well. On the other hand, if you live on like a hilly area, you might have clay soil. Those are microscopic particles, really tightly packed together, usually kind of flat, so they're stacked tight. And there's very little pore space for air and water to infiltrate. And then you could also have silt, which is somewhere in the middle, medium-sized particles and medium-sized pore spaces. Now, you can't change the soil texture that you have in your garden. Unless you cart in soil from another place, you can do it that way. But what you can do is you can change the soil structure. And soil structure is really just how all of those 4 ingredients, the minerals, the organic matter, the water, and the air, how they're put together. And good soil structure is really, it allows for particles to be stuck together, but not so much that nothing can infiltrate. So stuck together enough to hold on to that water, hold on to those nutrients, but still have enough space for water and air and earthworms, roots, and microorganisms to move around in the soil. And one way to increase or improve your soil structure is to add compost. Compost has many, many benefits for your garden. It's really one of the most important ingredients in a healthy garden. So you can improve your soil structure just by adding compost. So if you have sandy soil, adding compost will kind of act like a glue. It sticks the particles together and kind of closes up those pores. And if you have clay soil, compost kind of breaks up the particles and creates pore spaces. So it actually works for both ends of the spectrum. And it increases the water retention in your soil. So compost can hold 5 times its weight in water. So we really want to focus on adding compost to increase water in our soil, especially as we're approaching the hot summer months where we're not getting a lot of rain. And compost offers nutrients to your plants. So compost is 100% organic matter. When it's in your soil, it breaks down as the soil organisms consume it, and it feeds nutrients and water to your plants at a nice, slow, steady rate, which is what we want. And it also increases the microbiology in the soil because compost is really rich in life. As the compost is breaking down, it's being broken down by bacteria, fungi, invertebrates. And when we add it to our soil, we're inoculating our soil with that life. And that life is key in our soil. We can't have healthy plants we can't have plants, period, actually, without life in our soil. So I compare it to our stomachs, like our gut. In our gut, there are bacteria that help us digest our food. It's the same exact thing that happens in the soil. The life in the soil consumes the organic matter in the soil, and it feeds it to the plant in a form that the plant can take up. Plants can't digest that food without that life. And these are just 2 pictures of different kinds of life in the soil. There's the bacteria fixing nitrogen. So on plants like legumes, fava beans, soybeans, there's these little nodules on the roots that they're filled with bacteria that actually create nitrogen and add it to the soil. And then there's mycorrhizal fungi, which is really that you might have seen it if you dig up some nice healthy soil. There's some white webbing. That webbing is mycorrhizal fungi, and it's just this massive network that goes throughout the soil, and it really locks into your plant roots, and it feeds your plants the nutrients and the water from all over, not just so it reaches beyond. It's an extension of your plant's roots, and it really provides your plant with the nutrients and the water that it needs. And I'll just say one way to increase that life in the soil, what we already talked about, is adding compost, but also making sure we're not overly using synthetic pesticides or fertilizers, because that can damage the life in the soil. And then mulch. Mulch is another important way to keep your soil healthy and keep your plants healthy. And when I'm talking about mulch can be made out of a lot of different things. Mulch is really anything that we're using to cover our soil. It can be made of oyster shells, rubber pieces, gravel, all of those are mulch. But when I'm talking about mulch I'm generally talking about the organic mulches like wood chips, bark, or straw, because those organic mulches are going to give you the most benefits. So when those organic mulches break down, they add nutrients to the soil they feed the soil organisms that are then feeding your plants. A nice thick layer of mulch on your soil can also prevent weeds from germinating and growing. Mulch is really just like a protective blanket, so it covers your soil and it will keep the water that's in your soil from evaporating. So that's really important to use during these approaching summer months. It keeps the soil in place and prevents soil compaction. And it also, again, like a blanket, it keeps the soil cool in the summer and warm in the winter. So it regulates the temperature for your plant roots. It's important to keep your mulch away from the stems of the plant or like the trunks of any trees or shrubs. You want to keep that a space between your stems and the mulch, because too much mulch or mulch right up against the stems can lead to rot and diseases. And then one other note on mulch: if you do get a big delivery of mulch like in your driveway and you don't get to use it all in one day, it's best to tarp it if you can, because wind can take it away and blow it into the street, and then it can get stuck in storm drains and can cause a big problem there. So we want to avoid that.
And so then the next part of growing a healthy garden is fertilizer. A lot of us might ask, what is fertilizer? There's just so many. We go into the store, we see shelves of all these fertilizers, and it can get a little confusing. There's lots of different shapes and sizes and textures, different ways to apply it. But ultimately, all the fertilizers are going to have three important numbers. That's going to be the NPK, which is the nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. You want to identify this on any of the labels. And what the NPK is going to be the nitrogen, which you can think of as like the above ground growth, and the phosphorus, which is going to aid in the root development as well as the blossom production. And then potassium is going to support all around well-being of the plant. And these are the macronutrients. Other macronutrients that are going to be included in fertilizer could be sulfur, calcium, and magnesium. And then in addition to the macronutrients, we're going to see a combination of micronutrients as well, such as iron, zinc, copper, and so many more. And then we have a choice. We have a combination, or we have the choice between organic fertilizers versus synthetic fertilizers. And this is where things can start to get a little complicated, because look, these two look very similar. They're both tomato and vegetable food. It says it right there on the package, and there's some pictures of some nice healthy vegetables. But what is the difference between the two? Well, organic fertilizers are going to feed the microbiology that Charlotte was just talking about, all of that good energy and work that you put into increasing the health of the soil with compost. Now we want to keep it thriving, and we can do that by feeding it with organic fertilizer. Organic fertilizer is going to just increase the overall health of the soil, believe it or not just plants, but the soil as well. And then it allows the plants to absorb the nutrients that it needs when those plants need it. So it's going to be feeding the plants at a more natural rate, which is going to prevent a lot of growth spurts. So we're not going to be stimulating a lot of growth, which is going to be very healthy for the plant, and it's going to not attract as many pest insects. It's also a much more sustainable way to feed the plants. I can also share that organic fertilizers will not run off into local waterways. It's very difficult, if possible, to burn your plants if over applied. It's a much more economical way to feed your plants, because we're only feeding seasonally. We're not feeding that often with organic fertilizers, or I should say the dry granular fertilizer. We're typically just feeding at time of planting, and then maybe once or twice a year, depending on the plant itself. All the organic fertilizers are derived from natural materials from either plants or animals, and it's a renewable and or a byproduct of another industry. Whereas synthetic fertilizers are just strictly feeding the plants. So with that, we're going to want to apply that fertilizer according to the application rate on the package. So it's very important, if we're using a synthetic fertilizer, we want to apply according to the package instructions. Also understand that synthetic fertilizers act as steroids for a plant, so it will stimulate a lot of new growth. And the new growth, which is tender and filled with a lot of plant sugars, is very attractive to pests such as aphids, whiteflies, thrips, and so forth. So oftentimes when we have a lot of new growth being stimulated, we're going to see more pests out those parts, those new sprouts of the plant. We know that synthetic fertilizers have a tendency to be very high in salts, which can be detrimental to the soils over time. And the synthetic fertilizers, when over applied, can contaminate our waterways. They can also burn if we apply too much. And synthetic fertilizers are manufactured products extracted by chemical industrial process. So here's an illustration of organic fertilizers versus chemical fertilizers and how their integration with the soil is and with the plant. So organic fertilizers are going to feed the soil, which is more of a holistic approach, which encompasses the soil microbiology, which then has a symbiotic relationship with the root system and allows that plant to take the nutrients when it needs it. Whereas the chemical fertilizer is just strictly feeding the plant independently.
All right, and now we're going to talk water, because water actually, we don't realize, we forget how much water plays a part in our plant life, especially too much water actually can be quite detrimental. So we're going to talk about how to water properly, because improper watering can stress out a plant. Too much or too little will stress out the plants, and stressed plants invite in pest problems. So we want to focus on watering deeply and infrequently. We really want to water deeply so that the roots will follow that water deep down into the soil, creating an established hardy plant. And we want to also let the soil surface dry out a little bit between waterings so that our plants are not sitting in water, more water than they want. We don't want them to have wet feet, as they say. So this graphic just shows when you water deeply, the roots will follow the water nice and deep down. Where if you are watering just frequently, but not a lot, those roots are going to just stay at the top, and they're going to be fine and not very hardy, and your plant is always going to be struggling. And again, talking about soil, you do want to know what kind of soil you have, because it will affect how you water. So, because we have to understand infiltration and percolation rates. So if you have sandy soil, as I mentioned, there's big pore spaces, so that water is going to rush through, just like at the beach, the water rushes through and absorbs very quickly. So water is going to be absorbed quickly, and it's going to take the nutrients with it. So you're going to probably have to water more frequently if you have sandy soil. If you have clay soil, again, it's tightly packed, not a lot of pore spaces, very slow infiltration rates. So you're going to water slower, not quite as much all at once. You might want to pulse the water in, so just providing little water, let it infiltrate, a little more water, infiltrate. That's called pulsing. And that will allow for a more even percolation rate. We don't want to just throw a bunch of water on clay soil and have it pooling, because that will also lead to stress and potential rot. And another tool, or a tool to help you with the proper watering and appropriate watering for your plants, is drip irrigation. Drip irrigation can be really helpful, as you can set up a system or set up a schedule, and will give your plant consistent, regular watering, watering when it needs it. So in drip irrigation, it's just plastic tubing with emitters that sit right on the soil surface. So it's applying water directly to the soil. We're not throwing water around like a sprinkler. So it's really efficient. There's direct contact with the soil. The water is just going right in. There's less evaporation. That also leads to less weeds, because the water's not going where you don't want it to go. It's just going right into the soil, right to your plant that you want to be watered. You can set the timer so that it can be set off early in the morning when the air and soil is cool. So that also leads to less evaporation, and you don't have to get up at 5 in the morning to water your plants. And you can set the clock to have multiple start times. Again, if you have clay soil, you might need that multiple start times. And it just creates a system that will help you manage, prevent overwatering and underwatering of your plants. And I do also want to say it's not a set it and forget it system. We have to remember when we do have a system like this, while it can go for months working perfectly, we want to make sure we're frequently checking it for leaks, and any, making sure the water is actually going where we want it to go. And we do need to make changes for seasonal adjustments. So in the winter, we might set it to water less or just turn it off altogether. And then we have to remember to turn it back on in the spring.
All right. Other ways to get water out into our gardens if we don't have an irrigation system set up already, or if we want to add more water and increase that irrigation system. There's also these battery and solar operated remote controllers that connect to the hose bib. This is also a great opportunity if you're going away for a while. We can set up these systems to water plants where that irrigation system that you have from that controller that's mounted to the wall, like in the garage, if that system isn't set up in certain areas of the garden, this will help you to get water out into those areas with more ease. And what we're talking about when Charlotte mentioned the emitters, for those of you that aren't as familiar with irrigation systems or not as familiar with the terms, I just like to throw this in. We have that PE tubing, that black tubing. This is the photo that's on the right. This is typically about 1/2 inch, and either it comes with emitters in line that will release water, or we will plug in 1/4 inch tubing. Sometimes it's also called spaghetti tubing, which is the picture that's on the left. And then that tubing will have a little emitter on the end as pictured here, or it will have emitters within the line as well. It's really good to have an understanding of what type of irrigation system you have. And what I mean by that is understanding where and how much the water is, like where the water is coming out around the plants and how much water is coming out when the system is on. The irrigation emitters, such as on the picture on the left, come in different flow rates, such as 1/2 gallon per hour, 1 gallon per hour, 2 gallon per hour. Those are some examples. I typically work with 1 gallon per hour. I'm not sure if that's the most popular one with a lot of the irrigation installers. It might be. However, understanding if you don't know that your emitter, what the rate of water or the flow, the volume of water that's coming out, 1/2 gallon per hour versus 2 gallon per hour is a really big difference. So that's just one thing I'd just like to point out. It's really important to know how much volume of water is coming out of the emitters throughout our irrigation system so that we can understand when we're setting the clocks for 30 minutes, is it 1/2 gallon that's coming out, or is it a quart that's coming out, or is it a whole gallon that's coming out? And when we water, we want to always water at the drip line of the plant. Now, this is an illustration of a tree, but this applies to roses, to perennials, to large shrubs, to trees. We always want to bring it out at the drip line because, as Charlotte mentioned in the slide about watering deeply, we also want to encourage the root systems not only to go down, but out, because the root systems want to reach. They want to reach. And we're always want to focus the water at the fibrous new root hairs. And those are always going to be at the outer perimeters of that drip line of the canopy of the plant, as well as deep in the ground. So this is another illustration. So this is an aerial view of a plant. In this case, it's a tree, but it could be any plant. And we see that the root systems are spreading out beyond that canopy, which is that green in the middle. And so when we focus our water and our fertilizer, we're always going to focus it out around that band that's actually from the drip line out to that blue line. And the main reason why is because at the crown, where the top of the plant, top of the stems or the trunk meet the root system, that is going to be fairly large, and it's not able to absorb any water or food in a healthy way. It's really the fibrous root hairs that are absorbing water and food. So that's why we're always focusing the water and food out there. So what I like to share is this is someone who had joined one of our programs, sent me this picture afterwards. She emailed it to me and said, hey, I just was in your program and I learned so much. And I had some gardeners or some landscapers recently install this hedgerow of arborvitaes for me, and it looked beautiful. However, from what I learned, it seemed that the irrigation wasn't set up properly. And I know it's not easy to see in this picture, but not only is the irrigation emitter right there at the crown, but the mulch was about 3 inches up on the trunk of the tree. That crown really needs to always be exposed. We want to make sure that it's free of leaf debris, of mulch, and especially we don't want to water right there. We just want it to always be free and open so that it can really get nice air circulation. That emitter needs to get moved out at the crown. And as the plants grow, we might need to bring the emitters out further and around, and we might need to add more emitters around the plant. So these are just things that we like to just take notice and be aware of that'll really help the health of your plant. In addition, it's also nice to increase the permeable surfaces. So we really want to keep as much water on site. So as we do get rainwater, or when we are watering our gardens with the hose, or if we have a sprinkler system, it's just nice when the water can actually, move through the soil as opposed to running off solid surfaces.
All right, so sorry, answering a question. So now we know compost, fertilizer, water. Now what plants are we going to put in our garden? Is the exciting part. So we want to remember that we live in if you are in the Bay Area, we live in a very unique climate. It's a Mediterranean climate with mild but wetter winters and dry, potentially hot summers. So we want to choose plants that are suited for that climate. So either California natives or Mediterranean plants, because not every plant is going to like that difference in season. So we also want to focus, really study our yards, because even within each yard, there are microclimates. So we want to understand the conditions of our garden. So is there shade? Is there a low spot that gets a lot of water? Is there a really hot space up against the house? What are the different areas of our garden, and what are the conditions of each area? And then when we are at the nursery, also we can ask for pest and disease resistant varieties, because if we are in an area that we know our neighbors always get peach leaf curl or powdery mildew or some sort of disease, we can say like, hey, we don't want that. So if we're going to put in some sort of plant, we're going to ask to see if there is a resistant variety. And then we just want to make sure that it's called right plant, right place. We always want to put the right plant in the right place. Again, understanding microclimates. And then, so when we're at the nursery, we're going to make sure we're looking at these little tags that come in each of the plants. All of these tags have lots of really good information that's going to help you understand what those plant needs are. It talks about sun, drainage, watering, other maybe unusual conditions that it likes. It's also going to talk about size, which is really important, because when we buy plants at the nursery, they're small and hopefully they're going to grow a lot bigger. But so we want to make sure we're not putting them in a space that they're going to get cramped and crowded, and then that's going to stress them out as well. So again, we're going to study our garden's microclimates, understand how much space we have, understanding that plants are going to grow. Also asking yourself, how are you going to use the space? Are there pets, children? How are you going to move around the space? All of those are good questions to ask, especially when understanding that plants grow, trees especially. And then also another good question to ask yourself is, who's going to care for the garden? Is it you, or are you going to hire someone? To understand how much work might go into it. We want to make sure we're not setting ourselves up for too much work in the future. And then as we're planting, another thing to consider is irrigation needs. So we're going to put our plants together that require the same amount of water. Especially is important if you don't have drip irrigation. You're going to have to hand water. You don't want to have to lug your hose maybe all the way across your yard to water these high need plants. Keep those closer to the house. That'll be easier for you. And just again, the microclimates, sun, shade, wind, heat. Corners of the garden can have different conditions. So we really want to make sure that we're studying those. And again, as Suzanne mentioned earlier in the presentation, if your plant is always struggling, if you have a plant that's always struggling, always getting diseases, always having pests, it's probably just not in the right place. It's not happy there, and you're going to have to give yourself permission to remove it, because that'll just make you happier and the rest of the garden happier as well. And here are some resources for you for finding out what plants are going to work best for you. There's the Arboretum All-Stars, which is a searchable database based on location and your desires for whatever plant you have. There's the California Native Plant Society. And then there's the water use classification of landscape species, which will help you with your hydro zoning. And we'll send all of these links to you later. And then two more resources for you for pest management specifically. So if you do have pests in your garden, these are two resources for you to learn more about them and how to take action, in addition to future webinars, I'm sure. So there's the Our Water, Our World website. We have at least 18 fact sheets about different common pests and just general healthy gardening, lawn care, rose care, other issues. And then there's also the locations of all of the stores that Our Water, Our World partners with on that website. And then the UCIPM website is an amazing wealth of knowledge. I love it. I use it a lot. It's very helpful for if you do have a problem and you're not sure if it's a pest, if it's an insect, is it a disease, or is it just maybe a fertilizer problem? Because it could be all of those things. It has what I like to compare to the WebMD symptom tracker. You can really narrow it down just based on what kind of plant it is, what kind of damage you have, and it'll give you suggestions on what it could be. Super helpful.
All right, so just to follow up or to recap on what we've learned, tips for growing a healthy garden from the ground up. It always starts with building healthy soil with compost. That is the key. The more effort and energy you put in the soil, the happier and healthier your entire garden is going to be, regardless if it's trees, shrubs, perennials, fruits and vegetables, or even a lawn. And then take advantage of all the benefits that mulch has. Mulch is your friend. The only caveat was not to put it around the trunk of the plants. Make sure those crowns of all your plants are free of mulch and other leaf debris and soil. And then we want to feed our plants with organic fertilizers. Organic fertilizers are going to continue increasing the health of your soil and your plants for a very long, sustainable amount of time. And we want to water established plants deeply and less often. So all of those practices that Charlotte was talking about was for established plants. And something that we forgot to point out is when we have brand new plants, we're going to want to water them more frequently and encourage those root systems to grow out and down. But as they become established, that's when we're going to, and all the other plants in the garden that are established, we really want to water them deeply and less often. It's going to be a much more sustainable way to water. It's also going to save you a lot of water with that water bill and things like that. And then we want to adjust our irrigation controllers for the seasons. It's not set it and forget it, as Charlotte mentioned. We are constantly going out there and tweaking it. And maybe this is a monthly or seasonal, but we are definitely want to make sure that the systems are working properly. We want to go out and listen or turn it on manually to listen and see and make sure that a critter hasn't come and chewed off an emitter and that water isn't like blasting somewhere, but it's totally dry in other areas of the garden. And then understanding planting the right plant in the right place is just going to save you so much headache down the line. And then please, if any problems come up, visit the Our Water Our World website and the UCI IPM website, because those are both amazing resources for you to help you have the success that you are striving for in your garden. And then it's time to relax and enjoy all of your efforts. So, in close, I'd just like to share that the garden suggests there might be a place where we can meet nature halfway. So, we'd like to thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. As I shared, I'd keep you at 45 minutes. So, for those of you that have to leave, enjoy the rest of your afternoon. But for those of you who'd like to stay, please stay. We will answer all of your questions. And then I will, as I mentioned, I'll be sharing some follow-up emails that'll include a survey. Please, if you don't mind taking the literally 2 minutes to fill out those questions, it really helps us with our programming. I will send out the resource, the garden resource page again, as well as, as well as information where you can find this recording. And then we will get to your questions. However, if a question comes to mind, after the program, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. Our emails are here, but they're also going to be on that resource page. So for now, I am going to stop the recording and we will get into your questions.